Now in this video, I feel that the Lord would have me to give some testimonies of some folks who gained faith in this passage and properly practiced it and enjoyed the blessing of having prayers that have been put forth for years answered immediately. And also testimonies of those who rejected the teaching, considered it irrelevant and not worth their time, and what happened with them. Now in Romans 15:18, as I said on the prior video, Paul said that he would not presume to speak of anything except what Christ had accomplished through him. And I feel that I'm in the same spirit. I'm speaking of something that has been accomplished by Christ through me. These are not words of my own and teachings of my own, but these are testimonies of things that God has accomplished through me over the years with this testimony, with this teaching. So my first testimony is of a lovely Catholic lady that I encountered when I was ministering to her son. Her son was having a lot of problems, and God led him to me in a group that I was involved with, and as a result, his life began to get better and better as he turned more and more to Jesus. And his mother saw that, so she wanted to talk to me. And when I went to see her, I asked her how she was doing. She said, well, I'm fine, except for a little pain in my knee. Bothers me. So I felt moved by God to cast the demon out of her knee, and it immediately left. And she was able to get up and walk around normally. So this was the beginning of the power that God was exerting through me as one of his apostles to bring this apostolic teaching to her. This is an apostolic teaching, by the way. It's apostolic in the respect that I have been sent by God. I believe I have been sent by God to give it. And apostles are sent ones. So it becomes apostolic when an apostle comes and gives it. Now it's scriptural, so it's not me as an apostle bringing more forth new scriptures. That would be presumptuous. I'm only speaking of things that Jesus has accomplished through me. So as we got acquainted with one another, I asked her if she was in submission to her husband, knowing that her husband was a very difficult man, and that's part of the problem with her son. And she said, oh, yes, I'm old-fashioned. I'm totally submissive to my husband because he's the man of the house. I said, well, that's good. Now, do you go to church? Do you wear a veil when you go to church, or a hat? She said, oh, no, we abandoned that practice many years ago. I said, did you know that practice has power in it? And she said, no, I didn't know that. I said, well, as a Catholic, you probably practiced it just by ritual, by rote, as a tradition. You didn't really much think about it. She said, yeah, when I was younger, we never even went to church without some kind of a covering over our head. But that was gradually abandoned, and now we don't. So I explained to her that in 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16, there's a description of the power that can be brought forth to people when they properly practice the presentation of their heads to God, both men and women. So I explained about the head covering. So she heard me out, and later she told me that after I left, she decided she was going to try it. And but she was not bold about it. So she just took a piece of yarn, a small piece of yarn, and placed it on top of her head. Now she had the kind of hairstyle that lifted her hair up, so of course nobody could really see that piece of yarn except those angels up above. So she went to church, and she was praying, and when she got out of church, she heard that one of her prayers had immediately been answered. She didn't tell me what that prayer was or what that request was, but she just said, I've been praying for this thing for many years. And I got out of church, and I came home, and I got a phone call, and I found out that prayer had been answered. So I immediately attributed it to the head covering. And so the next week, when I went to church, I wore a hat. And one of my girlfriends asked me why I was wearing the hat, and I explained to her what you had taught me, she said. So the girlfriend said, "You mean a prayer had been answered just because you wore a hat, a covering on your head?" And she said, "Yes." So that girlfriend pulled a handkerchief out of her pocket and put it on her head, and they went into church. And shortly thereafter, that girlfriend also had a long time prayer answered. So this went around to a couple of her girlfriends, and they were all wearing hats to church pretty soon, and they were all getting answered prayers that they'd never had answered before. So this is a testimony of the power of God, the power that's, if we read 1 Corinthians 11:10, the power that's on their head, that's on a lady's head when she prays. I don't have a testimony of a man cutting his hair down from effeminately long to just normal. I don't have a testimony of that. But I'm sure that if somebody hears this and is wearing long, effeminate-looking hair and cuts it, that the same thing will happen with them. Now let me give you a testimony of a couple of women who rejected this teaching. I was in a backyard one pleasant Sunday afternoon at a barbecue, and I was sharing this teaching with a lady there, and she heard it, and then she just rejected it. She said, "Oh, Jim, that's for the past. That's not for today." And just as she said those words, her darling little girl put her hand on the hot exhaust of the lawn tractor that was sitting there, and started screaming. Of course, we all jumped up and ministered to her and, helped that little child. But I didn't attribute one thing to another until later, that afternoon when I was in fellowship with another brother, and he was telling me that he had been ministering to another lady at a backyard barbecue like I had on the other end of town, and she had done the same thing, and her little boy had stuck his hand through the fence, and the dog next door came over and bit it up real good, and he was screaming, and they had to help him. So as we compared notes, we came to the conclusion that the rejection of this teaching can lead to the angels lifting the protection off of the children of the women who reject it. Now, I believe that when people are ignorant of this teaching and have not had the teaching, that they're really not held accountable by God to the teaching. But once it's been brought to them, then they will be held accountable, and power will go forth one way or the other. That I believe is the way it works with all of the scriptures, and here by these testimonies we see that happened here. So to sum it all up, when a teacher opposed the teaching, the Lord sent authoritative reinforcements to help me to offset his arguments against it. This, I believe, was very powerful. He planted a Bible in my bookshelf that I didn't even remember it had been given as a gift. But when I needed it, he put my eyes on it. I pulled it out. I read the passage. It was ideal for what I was about to face. And when I go to see the minister, the man that wrote that expanded translation, Kenneth Wiest, was his Greek teacher. So he was just completely overpowered by Greek authority when he was coming at this meeting armed with his own Greek authority. And he was overpowered by greater Greek authority, and his argument was proven to be false, even though he didn't accept it and his two members of his flock didn't accept it. Now I haven't seen them in years. I don't know what happened with them, all three of those folks, but I'm sure at the judgment there will be an accounting that has to be made. And then these testimonies, this lady and her girlfriends begin practicing the head covering by faith, not by ritual or rote. And all of them start to get prayers answered they had answered before. This, to me, substantiates the idea that there is power hidden in these passages, in these verses, that can be obtained nowhere else, by faith nowhere else in the Bible. Now, that may or may not be true, but I believe that's true. So they get answered prayers, And these ladies who treated as irrelevant despised this small thing, this teaching. They had instantaneous retribution put upon them by the angels, in my opinion. Just as it says in Hebrews how the angels, that when you disobey them, there's going to be consequences. So all of these things acting together, in my opinion, and I believe the Lord is with me on this opinion, is that this practice, this tradition of God in the church, not a tradition of men, tradition of God, should be practiced by faith. Now, I don't suggest that ministers force their flocks under cover. I don't believe in that. I believe that the teaching should be given, an exhortation should be given, and then patience should be exercised while people wait to see if the teaching will be absorbed and practiced. The scripture says that each man's faith should be of his own conviction before God, so forcing this issue is not doing that. Each person needs to reach their own belief in it, or unbelief in it, one or the other. Now, if they reach the wrong conclusion, I believe God will send power to correct them. But if they ignore that, then I believe at the latest, at the judgment, they're going to be ashamed and suffer loss because they did not rightly divide the word. They will be ashamed and they will suffer loss because the scripture says that we have to carefully build upon the foundation of Christ. And this is one of the building blocks that you put upon that foundation. And when it's properly exercised, there's tremendous power, in my opinion. And when it's not, there's a loss of power. Women whom I know exercise this faith in this tradition feel empowered. They sense their power. They know that when they place the veil over their head, when they cover their glory, their prayers are going to be heard and they're going to be answered in some marvelous, miraculous fashion. I personally do not have long hair. What is long hair? Each person has to distinguish that for himself. On the Shroud of Turin, which I believe has a picture of Jesus Christ when he was crucified, his hair was down around his ears. That was not long hair. I believe the long hair referred to in 1 Corinthians 11 is effeminate long hair that reaches beyond that. But each person has to reach their own conclusion on that. Again, each person must stand in their own faith before God, in their own convictions, not in mine. So in closing, let me exhort you to go to God with your whole heart and ask God what the truth of this passage is. Is what the Apostle Jim is here saying the truth of it? Or is there some other interpretations that's the truth of it? Go to God sincerely with your whole heart and he will tell you. And then be prepared to practice whatever he teaches you. And to stand up for this faith, to contend for it, as I am doing. And if you reach a different conclusion, please contact me. I would like to hear about it. Thank you very much.